future educators and current educators understand how to incorporate what the lay people would call hard history into our everyday classroom lessons. And part of her work has been working with, it was then known as teaching tolerance, but learning for justice and the teaching hard history, looking at African American history and slavery, Indigenous American history and slavery. And she helped write standards, led writing the standards for this amazing resource. If you're not familiar with it, I do encourage you to check out the Teaching Hard History through Learning for Justice. There's an amazing podcast series. Bethany has spoken on that with Kwame Jeffries. My more recent connection to her was helping me in beginning the process of adjusting some of our curriculum to incorporate these difficult topics and to help people see if it's the truth, it's really not that difficult. She was warmly welcomed by our teachers, and I hope that you also will start to see some benefits to what she has to say as we transform our guiding principles and values on paper into something that we can actually put into practice. So Bethany, it's all you. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. I actually did have a sort of presentation. If I can be a co-host, or can I share my screen? It looks like I might be able to.
You can.
You're ahead of me in the game here. All right. I am a little worried. It sounds like your previous conversation was so great. I don't know how much I might have to offer. That's terribly new. But I will share sort of some of our guiding ideas as we created the framework for teaching American slavery. As a historian, I always do like to sort of back up and think about sort of why we're here. And just so sort of really briefly, knowing that I am preaching to the choir, why is it important that we do this? Well, right, hate is all around us. And I pulled out the Connecticut status numbers here, right, for white nationalist or neo-Nazi groups that are currently active in Connecticut. It's about the same number in Massachusetts, where I am. The other three groups are given the sort of ominously general term, general hate, that classifies what they're all about, right? According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there are 733 hate groups that are operating in the United States. It's actually an improvement from 2016-17, where there was 917 groups. In 2020, just a small snippet of law enforcement agencies, very few participate in the reporting, but they reported 8,263 hate crimes. And then the more likely number based on surveys that the FBI does is about 250,000 hate crimes. And we know that these things are not, that our schools aren't immune, right, to these kinds of instances and these this kind of hate, right? In recent years, and there's been multiple instances of nooses or racist text or language being sort of found in schools all across the country. So if we're not teaching our students that the United States has always been diverse, if we don't give them contexts in which they can understand the present world, then we're allowing, right, for an atmosphere where this hate can continue to breed. The other sort of why now continued is we all know as of May 9th, 2022, there are 89 live bills in different state legislatures that would restrict what can be taught in the K through 12 classrooms. And the most famous of those is, of course, the Florida Don't Say Gay bill, as it's been named. But we can see through this screen grab that there's actually like a pretty diverse group of states that are involved in this. And I pulled the one with Connecticut again. But, Illinois, Connecticut, Arizona, Alabama, all, Maine, New Hampshire. There's a whole variety of states where these bills exist. Many of them, and the Connecticut one is sort of typical. They use the same language of divisive topics to argue against teaching really anything that has to do with identity, whether it's racial identity, gender identity, sexuality, ethnicity. The Connecticut law, as you can see here, prohibits K through 12 schools from including in their curricula certain ideas related to race and sex, nor to include any curricula that is designed or intended to cause any individual to feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or other form of psychological distress on account of the individual's race or sex, right? That Connecticut law doesn't seem to be going anywhere. As I'm sure you're probably aware, it's a appendage onto an unrelated law. But the fact of the matter is that all of these laws are written with purposefully vague language, right? To make their enforcement and make their sort of powers of intimidation pretty substantial. And we all know that as teachers, right, our goal, our pedagogy is never to make students feel guilt and anguish, but in framing these laws as protecting certain students, what they're actually doing is discouraging teachers from including content that make all of our students feel represented in our classroom. And we know that when our students see themselves in the curriculum, they feel seen, they feel valid, they feel part of the story. We know that it helps their mental health altogether. We know it helps their performance in school. So the calculated use of kind of protection in these bills is actually protecting nobody and in fact doing harm. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I think it's very important that Connecticut take this role, right, and saying to teachers and to parents in Connecticut, look, this is what we are asking you to do, right? This is what you're supposed to be doing, is this kind of work. And so I applaud you with that. My last why now, and this is the last one, I promise, but I think it's important in sort of pulling things together. My expertise, as Jennifer said, is in African-American history and slavery. And so that's sort of the lens that I approach a lot of this from. And that's sort of how I see how we need to sort of include these more historically accurate standards that don't promote the sort of myth of a progressive American history, but instead reflect the diversity of the American story right from the start. And I think that this is a TripAdvisor review of a plantation in Carolina. It's called McLean Plantation, which purposely takes a focus on the enslaved population of the plantation. And I think this review is really important because it shows us that it's not just extremists, right, who have this sort of, who can have an impact on the way that we understand teaching, right? These ideas don't just exist within a fringe group of radicals, that what we have in the United States is a very sort of generalized misunderstanding of history. And so I'll sort of pull through this tweet or review as it was. She gave the museum 2 stars. She says, "My husband and I were extremely disappointed in this tour. We didn't come to hear a lecture on how the white people treated slaves. We came to get this history of a Southern plantation and get a tour of the house and grounds. The tour guide was so radical about slave treatment, we felt we were being lectured and bashed about slavery. My ancestors were from Sicily, never owned slaves, and my husband's were German, and none of his ever owned slaves. I am by far not racist or against all Americans having equal rights, but this was my vacation, and now we are crossing all plantation tours off our list. It was not what we expected. I'll go back to Louisiana and see some real plantations that are so much more enjoyable to tour." This review went viral, right, for a couple of different reasons. But I think it's actually really fascinating and really telling, right, about how the average person looks at American history, right? If we take the first part of this review, right, we didn't come to hear a lecture on how white people traded slaves. We came to get a history of a Southern plantation, right? As though those two things are somehow separate, as though they can be separated, right? If you are touring a Southern plantation, you are by, right, default also, right, touring a site of slavery. And so the idea that those two things were somehow two separate topics, I think is very telling, right? As is her claim that because she is from Sicily and her husband is of German heritage, and the fact that they didn't own any enslaved people, how this somehow makes that not their history. They shouldn't be responsible for learning about it because they are somehow not personally culpable, as though anybody alive today is personally culpable, right? And then last then but she still feels somehow, right, connected to that plantation owning family, that enslaving family, right? She doesn't need to hear about slavery because she's not personally linked to that history, but she does still see herself linked to the history of the white family there, right? Which presumably, being from Sicily, she is also, right, has no personal history in. And so the idea that she'll go back to Louisiana where she can hear this sort of real history, right, is also telling, right? And it's really telling because it talks about this really problematic relationship that Americans have to our past, right? And it does it in the context of slavery and the Civil War, right? But we can think about it in terms of, right, this happens all over American history in different contexts, right? What this reviewer was looking for was an Old South that never existed, right? And the Old South that has been brought down to us by things like the Lost Cause. I refer to it in my classes as the Gone with the Wind narrative, but my students are too young. They don't get that reference anymore, right? But this idea of this sort of genteel pre-Civil War population, right? And her review shows us that Lost Cause narrative is not just a sort of Southern, right, identity, that it's part of the American identity, and it's visible in everything from plantation museums, right, to films, right, to product marketing, Halloween costumes, right? You can find it everywhere, and its influence extends, right, from Angry Moms in Charlottesville, Virginia, 2017, right, to our state legislatures or the halls of Congress or our high schools, right, and elementary schools as well, right? And what that narrative does, what all of these narratives do, right, is, or I guess I'll say it this way, right? These narratives have more likely changed to include the voices or at least the experiences of marginalized people, right? That plantation tours have changed in order to include the voices of enslaved people. And I'm not talking about McLean Plantation, which is it's done a whole overhaul, right? But most places now you'll hear some reference to the work of enslaved people. But what we're doing with that is that we're incorporating diversity without changing the story, right? We're incorporating diversity in ways that allow what has always been a really progressive and celebratory narrative of American history to remain untouched, right? I call it the sort of things started out great and have been getting greater ever since kind of narrative of American history, right? So we allow for diverse narratives insofar as they don't kick us off of this progressive and celebratory vision of American history, which is my field of reference for teaching and scholarship. So what I would say is we need our classrooms to reflect the American past in all of its complications and contradictions, right? And this isn't just in service to the past. It's not just because that's what happened, right? But it's also in service to the future. Because how are our students supposed to understand and navigate this moment, right? That's incredibly complicated, if they're under the impression that up until now, the American story has been simple, right? That the American story has been the simple narrative of, progression under noble leaders who are moving us always closer to our high-minded ideals, right? So we're really not equipping our students to understand the present if they can't understand the complexity of the past. I also think that thinking about the past as complicated and complex as the present is hopeful, right? If we look at the past as the sort of good old days, right? I think that can make our students feel like there's really nothing they can do, right? In the present, because things are not like that anymore, when in fact they were never like that. So I always talk to my students and I tell them, look, the story in your classroom can be both and, right? Our nation's founding both created the first modern nation based on these ideals of universal equality and freedom. And excluded women, and codified slavery in its founding documents, right? And so we don't need to choose one or the other. In fact, history is more interesting, right? History is more relatable, right? When we deal with it in all of its complexity. Oops. So I read the Jamboard that Jen sent me, and you folks have identified a lot of what the challenges are, right? Political polarization and history and social studies content. I think there's probably never been a more difficult time to be a history or social studies teacher than right now because of the climate that we're in. Teacher preparation is also a difficult, I think, a challenge, right? That many of our teachers are products of the same kinds of systems that, right, that we're trying to change now. And we can't expect our teachers to have had, right, vast training in the content because that wasn't happening, right? And so as we try to sort of include these diverse narratives, we're also sort of have to help teachers, right, to feel comfortable in that process. Resources can be difficult. Making sure that folks have access to appropriate resources to teach this sort of content is necessary, but also provides an opportunity, because these resources, because they are so complex, can be great ways to teach our students sort of critical thinking and other kinds of skills, because they really have to do a lot of work with them to unpack what they're saying. So here's my sort of big takeaways and my big sort of framing about thinking about creating new standards and what this work looks like in our classrooms. One thing I think is really important is to be explicit about the why of hard history, both when you're teaching this in the classroom, but also as we're thinking about teachers, or as we're asking teachers to think about this in standards, right? And I begin my classes with, all of my classes with talking about this and saying sort of, we're doing this because this reflects the past, right? Like plain and simple, this is history. And it shouldn't need any more justification, right, than that. That when, if we were to go to the era of the American Revolution, right, we would see that it was a diverse landscape that we were dealing with. And so if we're not talking about that now, right, then we're really not doing a service to that history, right? But it's also important for us to understand how we got to where we are, right? What have been the sort of threads and that we're not in this sort of continual progression of equality, and what have been the moments of advancement and what have been the moments of decline. But I also tell my students, and I stole this directly from my colleague, Stephen Oliver at Salem State University, who wrote for Understanding and Teaching American Slavery, right? I tell my students, look, none of us can take credit for the Constitution, and none of us need to feel blame or guilt for slavery. That no one in this room is responsible for anything that we're going to talk about, right? What we are responsible for is understanding the information, learning the information, and what we do with it next, right? How do we take what we've learned and sort of work and make sure that we are striving for a more equitable world in the future, right? And sometimes when you say that, right, you can see this sort of like relief, right, come across students. None of us are responsible for this, right? We are responsible for learning about it and what we do now, right? I always think the best way to teach history, and particularly hard history, is to ground our discussions in sources, right? And those can be both primary or secondary sources. I think that it is much more effective, right, to have students read some of Thomas Jefferson's musings about the inferiority of African-American people in his notes on the state of Virginia to understand the hypocrisy of the American Revolution, right? It's much more effective to do that than to just have a slide that says the hypocrisy of the founders, right? Ultimately, your students are going to be more convinced because they've discovered that information for themselves, or they've drawn their own conclusions. And they're also sort of are going to have a less reflexively, reflexive kind of response, right? To being told that something they've always believed is less than 100% correct. And there are great sources for doing that are both primary sources, like I talked about notes on the state of Virginia, but also there's great secondary sources as well for doing this kind of work. And particularly at the elementary grade levels, there's some really good children's books, right? That can help teachers to sort of get into these topics with their students in ways that are accessible, but still powerful. Third, I think we need to integrate representative voices into both the curriculum and the writing process, right? And so as we're writing the standards, and I heard people from the previous session talk about this, right? As we're writing the standards, we want to make sure that we're including the voices of those who we are going to be teaching about, right? And sometimes that means looking for historical voices in the primary sources. Sometimes that means looking for secondary sources, right? Books, children's books in particular by Native or African-American authors, right? Sometimes that means looking for their input, right? For individual people's input and experts' input into the kind of content that is in our standards. So I think representation really matters, and it matters on all three levels, from the standards right into what's actually sort of getting into your classroom. As we're looking at, and this is something you're very careful of with the slavery standards, it's something we've been very careful about in this current iteration of the podcast, which is about Jim Crow, is to balance narratives of degradation and resistance. That how we represent people matters. And in our, in our zeal to make sure that students understand something like systemic racism, right? We don't only want to talk about oppression, right? Because amidst oppression, there's also resistance, and there's resilience, and there's families, right? And there's joy, and kids need to see themselves represented in the curriculum in that way as well. And then my final sort of big kind of precept, right, is to integrate slavery or integrate hard history, right? My take is slavery. We're working with more narratives in that, across the chronology and geography of your social studies curriculum. And I've said this so many times to my students. I teach history education to both elementary and secondary students at Salem State. And my students always envision this moment, right? And somewhere probably in like the 1830s, where they're teaching the slavery unit, right? And they imagine this moment where their students are, right, floating through on a happy, right, discussion of American history, and then boom, they're going to shatter it. And they're going to go from 1619, right, to the Civil War, all in 1-2 week unit. And it's that moment that they're really worried about, of like, what are my students going to do when we start talking about these topics? And my argument is that that moment shouldn't exist, right? Because we need to be talking about these things as we're going through the curriculum, right? Another thing I always say to my students is, right, there were Africans in Virginia before there were Pilgrims in Massachusetts, and there were indigenous people who were enslaved before that. So there's no point in American history where we shouldn't be talking about slavery. And really, we can expand that, right? There's no point in American history that we really shouldn't be talking about diverse groups of people, because we've always been diverse. And so if, when we start talking about, right, getting the Pilgrims into Massachusetts and the, right, Virginians into Jamestown, right, we also need to back up, think about who's here first, do that in a way that's concrete, that's not just the Indigenous people, but is really mindful of differences, right? Using tribal names, looking specifically at the cultures of different areas. And then also, as we're getting people here, let's not just think of voluntary migration, let's think of involuntary migration as well, right? So that we're bringing, we talk about the Middle Passage as we're talking about the colonization, right? Or the invasion of what would become the United States, as it were, right? And we carry that thread through the entire curriculum. So in every unit, we're talking about a diverse group of people, right? In every unit, we're asking those questions, right? That aren't just about George Washington, right? And Thomas Jefferson, but are about the sort of broader community, right? In which those people live. So I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about how we made the hard history frameworks and sort of some of the ideas behind their structure. And I recognize that that what we were doing was a little bit easier, right? Because we're dealing with one kind of content area in slavery. And so not everything about my experience writing these is going to be incredibly useful, but I hope as a sort of thought process, it can help you. So I wrote, I was one of the writers on the initial draft of the 6 through 12 teaching hard history standards, to the point of sort of getting the right people in the room. Those standards were revised with a team of experts on Indigenous history who put Indigenous slavery, who rewrote the standards, right, to put Indigenous slavery in them in more concrete ways. And the elementary standards were written by elementary experts, right? The hard history project and a lot of my understanding and work for the frameworks came out of my book, Understanding and Teaching American Slavery. All of these resources have the same goal, right? Which is to change the conversations that are happening in our nation's classrooms, right? And we recognize with all of these standards that in order to do that, we need to get a diverse group of educators and historians, right? All talking about the most current thinking on these topics. And so that's really what the point of all of these standards are. So when we were creating the standards, and now, of course, these are voluntary supplementary standards, right? Nobody has to use the Teaching Hard History American Slavery standards. And so we really needed to approach them with the idea that these needed to be easy for teachers to use. That was one of the main principles. And the way that we made these standards sort of easy to use may not fit the way that Connecticut needs to make them their standards easy to use. But I will say, I think that is absolutely key. The standards can be easy to use without the content of them, right, being simplistic. And so what we did is we started with sort of 10 key concepts, and these both sort of guide teaching, and they represent sort of some ideal sort of student outcomes, right? The sort of big picture things that we wanted students to understand. They're based on Ira Berlin's preface to my book. And teachers can look here and understand, sort of get a sense of the content that's going to be in the rest of the slavery standards in the same way that you have the themes that you've developed for Connecticut, right? That give teachers a way to sort of a context, right, in which to think about the rest of the Connecticut standards, right? All of the other content within the Teaching Hard History framework maps back to these key concepts, as you'll see in a minute. I know this is really small. Those key concepts are expanded into a scope and sequence that provides a blueprint for incorporating slavery across the entire sort of span of what would be a kind of US 1 curriculum. And we were cognizant that that's not entirely adequate to deal with slavery, but felt like we needed to have some boundary on the chronology of it. And that's a sort of our decision, and if you can see in my little, I was hoping it would be bigger when I actually put it on my big screen. Our decision was to try to keep most of the periodization of American history familiar. So we didn't want to completely upend, right, all of the curriculum, because as supplementary standards, right, teachers needed to be able to use this document and find where it fits into what they've already created, right, for their state. And so we wanted to keep the sort of same kind of periodization and communicate to teachers, right, that really within, you can change what you're doing, and you can change the version of American history that you are teaching in your classroom, right, without throwing away everything that you've ever done, right, but by incorporating, right, new understandings into those sort of existing, some of those existing plans and units. Of course, once you include all of those, right, all that diversity and all those different voices, you end up sort of telling a whole different story. But the idea here was that teachers could consult the standards as they were coming across a chronological era in their state frameworks and see sort of what the connections to slavery were. And here we were really sort of also working under that assumption that teachers haven't been trained in how to, in slavery itself, right, or in how to teach slavery. And so we wanted to be sort of didactic, right, about that piece of it.
Rita.
So yeah, I mean, we'll look at a sort of closer image of the scope and sequence and of a piece of the scope and sequence, so you can see what they look like.
What are you doing, Rita?
So I should say, right, that this point of sort of incorporating slavery into the larger standard or into the larger sort of chronology was not just to help teachers integrate that content, but again, it also goes to that point of weaving, right, this content throughout the entirety of the curriculum, right, that these are threads that get pulled throughout the entirety of the curriculum. That helps our students too, right, where they just see this as part of American history, and they're ready, if you've begun these conversations in September, they're ready to have some of the big conversations with you, right, by the time that you get there. So here's a sort of easier to read version of one of the summary objectives. So within each chronological section, we have summary objectives, and those summary objectives map back to those key concepts. And that's what that other document was. There's 20 summary objectives in the document. We wanted to keep it manageable for teachers. And this one is summary objective number 2, right? Students will be able to describe the slave trade from Africa to the Americas, right? And as we were writing these summary objectives, the fact that teachers hadn't been trained in this content became a key factor for how we proceeded, right? And so we created that category of what else should my students know, right? And this is information, right, that builds, right, from that summary objective, or that flows from that summary objective about sort of the racial, right, theories that justified enslavement, about the experience of the Middle Passage, the commodification of people. Really what we wanted to do there was give teachers enough information about that summary objective that they at least, that they knew where to go or what to look up to find more, right? Because it's really impossible to ask a teacher to teach, right, just a sentence that you give them if they don't have the training in the content. And when we're talking about things as difficult as the Middle Passage, for example, right, we can't expect, right, we can't expect people to know where to go and how to get up to speed. And so these ideas are to sort of try to get teachers up to speed, to help them find other resources. And then the last piece of each summary objective is, how can I teach this? And that points teachers to groups of specific resources. And we were careful here not just to point teachers to like the Library of Congress, right? Because it's so big and broad and it ends up not being useful, but instead to point them to very particular resources on very particular sites, um, and why and tell them why we chose those resources, right, to put here. There's, excerpts from John Newton's slave trade journal, right, that talks about resistance on board several of his ships, right? And so we tell teachers that that's how you can use that particular source. So again, these standards, these components of the standards speak to that fact that the literature on slavery is vast. Teachers haven't likely been trained on it. And so to make them usable, we needed to provide a little bit more than you might see in like general state frameworks, right? This is the standard that I would use in my classroom to do that work of beginning our discussions of slavery, right? In the 17th century, as we're talking about colonization in general. I will say, in addition to the sort of primary sources and some of the sort of infographics that we've linked to here, there's also great children's books for K through 5 or K through 5, including the 1619 Project's Born on the Water, which does a really nice job of talking about the Middle Passage in a way that's accessible for young kids. And so I really think that those children's books, and there's more and more of them that are coming out that are vetted and really, really historically accurate, can help students to get to a lot of this content at the younger grades. So how might this work in a classroom? I have a sort of elementary and secondary, and this is part of what I showed to Jen's teachers in the fall. And I pulled, these are from the elementary frameworks, right? And this is for the 3rd to 5th grade frameworks, right? And so the idea is, okay, so there's a few things that we need to understand if we want to think about childhood and slavery. And so that's what they call the summary objective essential knowledge. Students should know that enslaved people had families that could be split up at any time. Enslaved people loved their families just like other people. Enslavers separated families to make more money or as punishment. Once separated, families were rarely able to communicate or reunite. After the end of slavery, many formerly enslaved people searched long and hard, often in vain, to find their missing family members. And when children were allowed to live with their families, other enslaved people, or weren't allowed, other enslaved people took care of them, right? Like I say, easy. Difficult concepts, right? Language that we can communicate, right, to students with, right? And we can think about helping students, right, to recognize what they have in common with enslaved people, right? We can have them think about who they consider to be family. It doesn't need to be biological family. In fact, if it's not, right, that sort of gets us to some of the point. Think about what families do with each other, right? How do you feel when you're with your family? All of these sort of activities that map to some of those elementary inquiry models that you have, right? And about understanding family, community, and right. All of those can also be used to teach this particular or this particular sort of lesson also meets all of those. And then we can expand on that by looking at a source that's accessible, if not easy, right, for students to understand. More people have seen this now than used to. Tia Miles has a great book about it called The Things She Carried, right? But this is Ashley's sack. It's a grain sack. It's now in the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, right? And I wrote the inscription that's on it. It's very simple, right? I transcribed it for you, right? My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It had a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her it'd be filled with my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother, Ruth Middleton, 1920, right? As we think, we can scale this source up, and I use it with my college students, right? And we can use it with elementary students, right? Our objectives are just going to be different, right? We can think about, right, love between mother, right? Mother and daughter. We can think about sort of family separation at its most basic level. We can think about the fact that Ashley, who was a little 9-year-old girl, like knew to keep this sack safe, right? That it was special enough for her, that she kept it safe. And in fact, it's traveled down through this family with its story for generations, right? And what does that tell us about Ashley and Rose? What does that tell us about this moment, right? What does that tell us about the value of this sack to their family, right? We can have those kinds of conversations with our students about how enslaved people maintained, right, bonds, and about family separation using this particular source to discuss it, right? And then we can supplement with a children's book like Love 12 Miles Long. And I've highlighted the social justice books list there. They're a great repository for responsible, right, and kind of vetted books about these sort of topics. But this particular book is about Frederick Douglass's mother walking 12 miles one way at night in order to tuck him into bed at night once she was sold away from him, right? And so again, sort of that relationship, right? Familial family relationship in slavery after sale is communicated there as well, right? So we're meeting some of those general, and there's also using Essex history frameworks, or excuse me, teaching hard history frameworks for K through 2 that deal with family separation as well. So as we're thinking about identity, right, family, community in those elementary grades, right, we can have students, we can approach, right, this kind of history if we know about it, right? And we need to know to sort of make those connections. And that's where I think some of the disconnect, right, happens. At the high school level, we have more in-depth discussions of the domestic slave trade. Here, students will examine how the expanding cotton economy spurred Indian removal and the domestic slave trade. And it goes into more detail there about Native American removal and how that increases land that's available. The labor of African Americans being sort of profit in the system, and how more than 1 million enslaved people were moved from areas of the upper South to the deep South in what's called the Second Middle Passage. I teach the domestic slave trade in my classroom as the beginning of westward expansion, right? Thinking about, look, for a lot of people, westward expansion wasn't going to dig gold in California, and it wasn't going to on the Oregon Trail to Oregon, right? For a lot of people, westward expansion meant moving from coastal Georgia or South Carolina to a place like Alabama, Arkansas, East Texas, right? Into those lands that were opened up either by the Treaty of Paris or the Louisiana Purchase or Texas annexation, other things, right? And that when individuals move from those areas, right, into to participate in cotton agriculture, right, that they're bringing some of their enslaved people with them, or they are purchasing additional enslaved people to go with them. I put it in the context of things that we all talk about, right? In high school, right? We talk about the sort of development of the mill system and industrialization and urbanization of the North, right? You can juxtapose the urbanization of the North, which of course includes cotton, right? Manufacturing, relies on actually the increasing sort of entrenchment, right, into plantation agriculture in the South, that the South doesn't make that turn towards industry and urbanization. It gets further entrenched in slavery and agriculture via the cotton gin, right, and the development of the cotton gin, which makes short staple cotton viable, right? We look at the expansion of cotton and the expansion of slavery and the westward movement, right, of enslaved people. We talk about, I mean, there's a lot you can do with this map, and I won't belabor it, but enslaved populations in Virginia aren't declining, right? Even though people are being moved sold out of Virginia, which tells us something about the nature of slavery in Virginia and the fact that Virginians are anticipating being able to sell people to the south, to further south. But we talk about this in general and thinking about each one of these dots represents 200 people, right? And boy, isn't that a terrible way to think about the lives of 200 people, right? That behind every one of these dots, there are 200 lives that are upended, right? This is just our cotton production numbers. And what does that look like, right? We can see what it looks like in terms of the expansion of slavery and the expansion of cotton. We can even see how this is having an impact on Native Americans when we look at where cotton is being grown and link that to Cherokee, right? And Cherokee Choctaw, right? Removal. And but are we really understanding those experiences? And so with that, right, we can use Ashley Sack again, right? We can also use more sophisticated, not that that's not sophisticated, but we can use sources that might be sort of beyond, right, what our younger kids can do. This is a document, and in the interest of time, I'll just sort of talk you through it. This is a document that was from Z.B. Oakes, who was a slave trader out of Charleston. All of his records were seized by the Massachusetts 54th and the 55th Cavalry after Charleston fell in the Civil War, and sent to Frederick Douglass, right, as a sort of a prize, kind of, right, for the work he had done, and to end it. And so Tom has been sold, right, and his wife has convinced her enslaver, right, to allow her to send a message to him. And you can see from looking at the original that it's the same handwriting, right? So Fatima is dictating this letter to her enslaver, who's going to send it to Tom's new enslaver, who may or may not send it to Tom, right? But there's all these layers of mediation between this husband and wife. And there's things that my students always pick out from this document. And the first thing that they picked out is Fatima's enslaver says, as his so-called wife wishes to send some message to him, right? The fact that Edwards doesn't recognize, right, Fatima as Tom's wife. And of course, there's reasons for that, right? But that always stands out to them. And Fatima, at the end of her letter, right, signs it, your wife, right, Fatima. That difference is stark to them, right? My students always pick up on the line, howdy and goodbye, for I never expect to see you again, right? It sounds funny to them, right? But we talk about those layers of mediation, right? Are you really going to say exactly what you would say to that person, right? If you have to dictate it, right, to your enslaver first. But the thing I really like about this letter is that there's this element of resistance that you can see in it. And this is so important as we think about these moments, right? Here's where we're sort of doing some of that what is managing, right, of the narrative. She says, try and do the best you can. And if you have a good master, behave properly to him and try to think about your master in heaven, right? My students are always struck by this. They're like, why is she telling him to be right, to be good? And again, thinking about those layers of mediation, right? Fatima is saying this to her enslaver. Every enslaver thinks that they're good. They're a good master, right? They all do. And so he's thinking, oh, Fatima, right? Look how she's so good, right? She's telling Tom to be good. She's good. I like Fatima, right? On the other end, Tom's new enslaver is going to read it and be like, all right, good, right? Tom's going to be, here's his wife, right? Telling him to behave, right? He's going to work out just fine. She's setting herself and Tom up, right, in the best possible way that she can, right? Knowing that these enslavers are reading her text. But she's got that if in there, which Tom was going to recognize, even if the others don't. And then she ends it, try to think about your master in heaven, right? Ultimately, who is your master? It's God, right? So there's Christianity as a mechanism of resistance here too, right? That look, these guys aren't anybody's master. Ultimately, it's God, right? And so there's this piece of, we get the both, right? And here, right? This is both evidence of this family being torn apart, right? She's obviously heartbroken, and it's still her sort of getting in her opportunity to get kind of won over on them, right? So we can think about, as we're building with the sources, right? We can, as we're thinking about the different grade levels, we can become more and more sophisticated, right, in the way that we're sort of talking about the sources with our students. And hopefully you can see, right, how this kind of source is so complex, right? My students get super interested in pulling it apart. And same thing with Ashley's SAC, right? You need to think through all of those questions about how you analyze a source. You need to really critically think about what's happening at the moment of the source's creation in order to understand it, right? And so some of these sources are some of the best sources to teach those kind of critical reasoning skills because they are so complex, right? So the last thing that I'll say is, and I've heard folks talking about this before, is when we wrote the Teaching Hard History standards, like I said, they're supplementary standards. We have no way to sort of enforce or anything with them, but we knew that teachers were going to need more content, right? And we knew that teachers were going to need more sort of professional development, right, for lack of a better word, around this content. And we couldn't sort of individually provide that, right? But what we did do was try to make sure that we had digital content that teachers could locate when they wanted to know more, right? And so this idea of, right, none of us are going to be ready to teach all of this on day one, right, is something that we considered too, even with as we framed the frameworks the way that we did. So we created a teaching library of resources. They're classroom ready resources that we've pulled from all sorts of websites and are linked to the standards. We created, big name scholars talk to us about our key concepts and provide more information and explain them in a little bit more detail in these like 5-minute videos. There's the Teaching Hard History podcast, which is now finished up its 4th season, right? Where content experts come and talk about all sorts of different subjects that are aligned with not just these frameworks, but with teaching African-American history in general. And we also have the series of books that the frameworks and the podcast is all based on, which is the Harvey Goldberg series for understanding and teaching history. And there's LGBTQ history in there. There's a Native American history book that's coming out momentarily. There's slavery, civil rights, Jim Crow is in development now. So there's a lot of resources that we tried to make available online, or at least provide sort of links to. And so I will say sort of, so as we're thinking about, and as you're thinking about doing this in Connecticut, and again, I know I'm reiterating what others have said, history-focused professional development opportunities are going to be key, right? As we think about how this is going to be implemented into schools. And that means getting content experts, getting representative voices from communities, all involved. And I know that you have sort of local control over curriculum. And so, right, that's going to mean working with particular school districts. But teachers, we need to give teachers the tools to feel confident enough to do this in their classroom because of the politically charged nature of social studies teaching right now. And because, right, again, teachers are products of the system that we're trying to change, right? And then I also think that you can or might include links to sort of some vetted resources that do provide, we all know you can find really good stuff on the internet, really bad stuff on the internet for teaching. And these are a couple of good podcasts that will allow teachers to sort of go and dive into particular content resources as they sort of as they recognize the need for it as well. And so providing lists of resources or places to find resources that are representative and vetted, I think is also a great idea. I hope that that is at all helpful for you in thinking about this process.
Thank you so much, Bethany. I really appreciate, again, you bringing sort of a bit of a bridge between your own experience with one particular topic, but I saw so many parallels as you were revisiting those concepts and the standards. And I hope that it's definitely a model that we can keep in our mind as we're trying to frame out what's going to be best for our teachers. I did jot down a lot of our plans as the standards writers, like leadership team we've been talking about. We've discussed that need to maybe have samples within the standards, like brief suggestions of key ideas. And then eventually, not only as we create this model curriculum K-8, but just in general for the secondary levels to also have some type of resource library available for teachers. The notion of the podcast that we've talked about doing, maybe once in a while having something specific to these topics that are historically more difficult for people to wrap their head around in teaching, especially to a lower level. And then our rollout sessions, once we have these new standards, we're going to have to come up with our plan to really help teachers all across the state understand why we have them, how to incorporate them, and how to really do service, again, to those guiding principles and themes that we've set forth that are going to be found throughout these standards. So I certainly appreciate these ideas we have from you. Everybody else, definitely, at your leisure, if you want, take a look at those Learning for Justice Teaching Hard History documents. Everything is linked in the chat as well with a few of the other resources that Bethany and our other presenters shared. And again, if you remember, this is being recorded, so you'll always be able to go back and look at specific ideas that were shared in both our first panel presentation and this one. So Bethany, again, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Tony, I'm going to kick it back to you.
Ooh, yes. Thank you so much. I saw a hand. I think Waltrina had a hand. We are going to go to breakout groups in just a moment. But Waltrina, if you had a question or comment, I'd like to entertain that now.
Yeah, I did. And it's primarily because of an encounter that I had with students when I taught an African American heritage after school program. And questions that often came up from my students was, well, why is it that we always start from slavery? Why is it that we don't start from, was there anything else that happened with Black people before that? And so that would be the question that I present for elementary students. There's loads of resources for upper grade students, but for younger grade students, when you talk about great African empires and things of that nature before, and a lot of the industry that came from there with people who were stolen from Africa, in addition to just the fact that slavery was not limited to what we see in the United States, that every culture had it. So, we want little kids to be able to have that kind of feedback too. So how did you incorporate that into what you do?
Yeah, the slavery standards actually begin in West Africa, right? They begin sort of laying out the context of we don't go back to ancient right, Africans, so we don't go back to Ghana, but we begin in West Africa at the sort of time of contact, thinking about sort of what is the context in which the African slave trade comes in. And I believe that the elementary standards do the same thing, although I'm slightly less familiar with them. So we were really cognizant of making sure that students understood that that African people were not universally enslaved, right?
Yeah.
And that this was a process of taking people who were free and in communities and with economies, right, and governments, and pulling them out of those places and enslaving them. For younger kids, I will say that 1619 Project book, Born on the Water, does a really nice job of setting up setting up Africa before slavery. And
Okay.
it's about half of the book. The premise of the book is a little girl who needs to write about where her family's from, and she doesn't know because she can only go back a certain number of generations. And so her grandmother is telling her about how we were born on the water, and meaning in the midst of the slave trade. But she talks about what West Africa was like before, right? That trip. And so there's, like I said, there's really great ways that you can talk about this stuff with your kids. It's just, there's so much to sift through to find, right? To find those great ways, I guess is what I'm saying. So those social justice books is one really nice way to look at stuff.
Okay.
Okay, thanks again so much to Bethany J. We're actually going to work with her a little bit more. We're working on a plan to potentially work with her more as we go forward. What I'd like to do now is we are going to, oh, sorry about that. I had a notification on my screen. We're going to move into our breakout groups, but I want to see whether or not folks need a 5-minute break. I'm seeing a lot of yeses. I'm seeing some yeses. Let's take a 5-minute break. We are not extending these sessions. We are out of here at 3. I'm trying to go outside. I got some mulching to do. So let's take a 5-minute break and we'll be back at 2:10.